Hello, friends, and welcome back. Um, Today, we're going to talk about some issues with gender that are kind of within the purview of contemporary anthropology and conversations that not just anthropologists are having, but to kind of reflect on a moment about how anthropological ideas, information, theories, stuff like that are reflected in contemporary issues that sort of everybody is talking about, I guess, right? So this is sort of anthropology in the modern world, anthropology in today, so to speak. And we're going to talk about gender and particularly sort of the control of women and the control of women's bodies, I guess. And so we're going to talk about a couple of different aspects. I'm going to try to lend a bit of a perspective on some of it, those kinds of things. And I do need to warn you that some of this may be a little bit difficult to hear. It may be a little bit triggering for some people, and I mean that respectfully. That some of the things that we're talking about to American ears sounds very quote unquote gross, right? So I want you to know that this might be a difficult lecture for some students, right? So let's start talking about one of the big issues that we've sort of seen in the last several years now is a conversation about head coverings that women wear. This is usually referred to as the burqa, even though the burqa is actually a specific head covering. And a lot of people say burqa when they mean a hijab or they mean one of these other kind of head coverings, these kinds of things, right? Um, this is not something that is particularly common in the United States, and so many Americans are unfamiliar with it, right? So this came about several years ago, I guess a popular conversation started with it. Um, so let me reflect on this. Head coverings are something that have a very, very long tradition throughout the world, including in the Western world, right? Um, uh, so today in the Western world, I would argue that we probably only see like nuns wear them, right? Or women when they are getting married wearing some kind of head covering. The truth is, as I said, historically speaking, these were very, very common throughout the world, including in Europe, and at times even in the United States, that it was expected that women would cover their heads, right? Um, from an anthropological standpoint, right, as we have discussed, this is one facet of a culture, and we are coming in with an idea of cultural relativity, right, and trying to not be judgmental, trying to understand what this means and why it means it, and these kinds of things. As we often do, we are also looking at this from a perspective of the individuals who participate in this cultural practice. And one of the things that we find is, and a lot of Americans are surprised by, is that in many cases, this is something that women choose to do. There are countries and places where it is literally the law that women have to wear a head covering. But in many places, actually, it isn't a law. It's not something that is enforced. It is rather something that women elect to do, in the same way that I elect to sit here in a tie that it takes me an extra minute to get ready in the morning and wear. So too many women decide that they would like to wear this, right? I've had students, of course, from literally all over the world, and many of them tell me, they say, I choose to wear this, but my friend doesn't, or my sister doesn't. They don't like it. It bothers them, and that kind of thing. But I like wearing it, so I do. I've had many students from parts of the world, just like last year, year before. I had a student from Jordan, and she was telling me that um, she was in her early 20s, 22, 23, and she was telling me that many of her friends that are a little bit older or cousins that are a little bit older, they said, yeah, you kind of hit a certain stage in life and then you decide to start doing it, right? She's like, I never wear one, but my sister is older. She got married and her husband didn't care. but she was like, "Oh no, I'm married now. I'm a woman and this kind of thing, and so I'm gonna start wearing it, right? You know, this is what I want to do, right?" So many times this is misunderstood by Americans as something that is required, and it's not. Again, there are countries where this is the law and you go to jail if you don't wear it, but again, that's pretty rare. For example, when I was in India a couple years back. I saw women wearing burqas, hijabs, you name it. Very, very common on the street. That it is not a law in India. It is not a requirement in India. These women choose to wear it, right? And there are those in the West that say, oh, well, these women are forced to wear it or they're pressured to wear it. Well, as an anthropologist, my problem with that is that it removes agency from the individual. It removes their ability to say, this is something that I want to do. We are dismissing their decision to make choices in life in the same way that um, to again bring it back. I wear a necktie every time when I'm teaching, right? I like wearing a necktie. I enjoy putting on a necktie. Lots and lots of people hate wearing a tie. Lots of men are like, oh God, I don't want to have to wear a tie every day. I actually really like wearing a tie. I've got, God, 50 ties. I like it. Now, do I like it because I was pressured by society? Well, maybe a little bit, but at the same time, it's still a decision that I make despite the influence of a broader society that says a professional man should be wearing a tie when he's working, right? Okay, so were these women under the same or similar social pressure? Maybe, yeah, but that doesn't mean that they also aren't making a conscious decision on their own, you know? This is something that Americans have gotten really wrapped up in. I have seen, cable news talking about this and all of these kinds of things, about women's head coverings. There's two things that I want to point out here. One is that in the countries that women are required to do this, many times you see them saying, you guys are obsessed with this in the West. We're not. And so there was a wonderful article published many, many years ago called These Are Not Our Priorities by an anthropologist who was interviewing women in the Middle East, where this is common in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa. This is a very common practice of various head coverings. And it was interviewing women that were wearing head coverings, and in places where it was required by law. And many of the women pointed out, they said, yes, this is required by law. Yes, we are forced to do this. But again, this is not our priority. When we're talking about fighting for women's rights or gender inequality, they're like, we care about women having the right to vote. We care about women having the right to have a job, get a divorce, those kinds of things. We have to wear head covering. Okay, fine. We have bigger issues that we would like to talk about. And yet, in the West, there are literally like foundations and nonprofits set up that are fighting against women having to do this. Now, again, I'm not saying that I'm for women being forced to have a head covering. Obviously, I'm not for anybody being forced to do anything that they don't want to do. However, I do think it's a little bit strange that, in a country potentially where women don't have the right to own property, we're worried that they have to wear a veil. One of these things has a materially detrimental aspect to their life, and one of these doesn't. And so many anthropologists have sort of pointed out that it's like we might be focused on the wrong thing here. We're worried about a paper cut, but we're ignoring the gunshot wound. Not to give it a morbid example, right? The other thing is that as Americans, maybe we aren't reflecting on the ways in which we too are subjugating women as a class, right? This was a cartoon that was published many years ago now. And I've always found it kind of funny, right? That yes, it's a little bit on the nose. It's a little bit of an obvious, sort of statement. But at the same time, the pressure that women are under in our own society to look a certain way, to dress a certain way, is pervasive, it is toxic, it is detrimental. Let me remind you about things like eating disorders, which kill thousands of women in our culture every year and are entirely based on our cultural expectations of what women are supposed to look like. Um, and so I think that we are throwing stones in our glass house here, that we have decided that the ways that these other cultures have um, constrained women and subjugated women are terrible, while we are ignoring us doing, the same thing, right? Of the controlling of women's bodies. And I would argue that there is an element to the idea, again, that in these countries where women are forced to wear head coverings, veils, burqas, hijabs, whatever, this is also something that is not separated from our culture. Okay, so recently there was a thing about a burkini. The burkini is exactly what it sounds like. The burqa meets the bikini. For women who, for religious reasons, cultural reasons, whatever, decide that they do not want to be wearing, um, that they don't, that they need to cover themselves up more, but still want to be able to, live a life, go to the beach, those kinds of things. France actually passed a law saying that the burkini could not be worn on public beaches. And so they literally were going to public beaches and saying, you're covered up too much. You have to take that off. Obviously, this was a part of the Islamophobia and the anti-Islamic backlash that we have seen over the last couple of decades, particularly since 9/11 here in America, although that's been going on for quite a while. Anti-Islam has been going on quite a while in Europe, And so these cops were literally going to public beaches and saying, you have to remove that. And I've talked about this in many classes before, and I had a student who was Italian, and he was telling me, oh, well, yeah, absolutely. It's totally fine that they do that. And I said, why? And he said, well, you don't know what they have on under there. And I said, if I went to the beach wearing a suit and tie, you wouldn't know what I had on under my coat. And he said, well, they might be terrorists. Let me point out that the linking terrorism with Islam is an extremely racist idea. It's also really a silly idea because most global terrorists aren't Islamic. I'd like to remind you that domestic terrorism groups in the United States have killed way more people than foreign terrorism groups. So the KKK, white supremacists, things like that. I mean, the Klan has killed thousands and way more than the number of people that were killed on September 11th, right? So this idea that foreign terrorists are somehow way more problematic than domestic terrorists is simply not factually accurate, okay? I'd also like to point out that there's literally never been a suicide bomber or whatever in France that was a woman wearing a burqa. And so the idea that, oh, we have to ban burqas to prevent terrorism or to prevent suicide bombers is sort of like saying we need to outlaw unicorn farms because they are very cruel. It doesn't exist. It's never existed. We're passing a law to prevent a thing that isn't real, right? So it is straight up racism. It's straight up xenophobia, these kinds of things. But it's also not something that is new. In the United States, for example, it kind of went, sort of the opposite way for a very long time of controlling women's bodies in public spaces, saying you have to show more skin, or I'm sorry, you cannot show too much skin, as opposed to now with the burkini saying you have to show more skin. It's all a way for us to tell women what they have to be. In the United States, we had laws that women, if they were revealing too much skin, they could literally be arrested. And women were, thousands of women all over the country were arrested because they were too scantily clad. They were showing too much skin. And so, again, I know that this is sort of the opposite direction of women need to show more skin and take off the burkini, or women are showing too much skin and need to cover up. But again, it all serves the same purpose, which is this controlling position of women. Okay, we're going to shift gears just a little bit here now and actually talk about circumcision. And again, this can be a tough conversation for many people to have. In the West, when I say circumcision, you probably think of men. Okay. The truth is, around the globe, we also see that there is a type of circumcision that is performed on women. And it is something that we have had a lot of conversations about within anthropology and that we have struggled with, and I'll explain why. Let me first say that there is literally no reason to circumcise men. Circumcision was not something that was practiced unless you were Jewish over the last many thousands of years, or Muslim for the last 1400 years. Christians were not typically circumcised in the United States until the 20th century. And the reason why had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with sex. There was a belief in the early 20th century that if you circumcised men, they would be less likely to masturbate. The philosophy was that it made sex less pleasurable by cutting the foreskin off of men. And so they decided, because of, at the time, this philosophy that masturbation was evil, masturbation was going to lead you down a path of sinfulness, that it would make, there was actually a medical doctors thought, oh, it makes you dim-witted and stupid and slothful and lazy and all of this crazy stuff that has no bearing whatsoever, no science behind it, you know. And so they decided to start circumcising men. There is literally no medical reason to do it. Male circumcision is a process that not only has no pluses, but there are drawbacks. When you circumcise a boy, you are cutting thousands of nerve endings in the penis. And honestly, there is a lot of evidence now that this decreases sexual satisfaction, it decreases sexual sensitivity. There are some men that have this done, and it leads to things like erectile dysfunction, infections in some parts of the world where it's not done properly, those kinds of things. And obviously, that's a pretty sensitive area. You don't want an infection there. So, male circumcision is not something that serves a cultural that serves a medical purpose. It is simply a cultural process. I bring this up because we're going to talk about female circumcision, right? The obviously women do not have foreskin the way that men do, and the United Nations World Health Organization is actually classified 4 different types. Probably the most common is to remove the clitoris, right? And this causes a lot of medical problems. One, obviously, it decreases sexual satisfaction. It decreases sexual function because the clitoris is the primary sort of sensory organ for female orgasms and those kinds of things. This is something that I talk a lot about in my human sexuality classes. But the other big problem is that when you are cutting that, it leads to health problems later on. Obviously, there's the early health problems of infection and things like that. But one of the other problems is scarring. And so during childbirth, this becomes a really big issue because skin stretches, scar tissue doesn't. And so many women who have had female circumcision, I'll call it now, we'll talk about it in a second, have an issue with when they're giving birth, the tissue actually tearing, and it leads to bleeding and death. Okay, so it is a really big issue. It is a really big problem. This is something that currently in the world, about 200 million women have had one of these processes done to them, primarily in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And type 1 and 2 are by far the most common here. Type 3 and 4 are pretty rare. Those kinds of things, particularly 3, I should say. And so it is something, though, that we struggle with because we come from a position of respecting cultural practices and trying to say that even if people are doing something that's very different from us, we should not be telling them how to live their lives. At the same time, this is something that literally is killing people, right? And so in anthropology, there has been a debate for many, many years of should we fight against this practice? And I don't have a clear answer for you. On the one hand, we say, how is this any different than what we do to young men in our culture? Like we're telling them to stop doing something that we ourselves do in a different fashion. Like I said, similar to head coverings and scarves and burqas, and at the same time, we are pressuring women to show skin and be sexy and lose weight and kill themselves with eating disorders, and have plastic surgery and all of these kinds of things, right? So on the one hand, how the hell are we any different? How the hell are we any better? Should we really be going around telling people what to do? Plus the general process of we should not be telling people how to live their lives. On the other hand, we are also recognizing that women die from this. This is killing people. This cultural practice is extremely harmful. It is violent, those kinds of things. So, should we be fighting against it? This is complicated by the fact that there are many, many women who choose to have this done. There are some that are forced into it at a very young age. They do not have an option. But there are many women that elect to do this because it is something that culturally they want. They say, this shows that I belong to my people, my group, my religion, my whatever. I want this done, in the same way that there are plenty of people in the United States that go through painful procedures, not as violent. I'm not trying to say they are, but maybe painful procedures or things like tattoos or piercings or plastic surgery because they want a particular aesthetic. They want to belong to a particular group. They want to show a certain, cultural affiliation. And so, I don't have a clear, guidepost for you here. It is a debate that we have had for literally decades. It is a debate that has been held in lots and lots of public forums in terms of news and books and everything else, right? So one of the things that I want to point out, because we've had the conversation before about how language represents cultural ideas, but also language helps shape our cultural ideas, is what do we call this process? Many times you will hear this called FGM, which stands for female genital mutilation, right? That sounds really harsh. I mean, that like genital mutilation, you're like, God, that's serial killer talk. It's disgusting, right? But there's also a lot of people that say, why don't we call this female circumcision, right? It's something that serves no medical purpose and has many health, uh, uh, downsides, just like male circumcision does here in the United States. So why don't we call it male genital mutilation, right? Oh, well, because we do it, and that makes it normalized. So we call it male circumcision. Well, the thing that we're doing to women with this in these areas is no different in that aspect, that it serves no medical purpose and it has many downsides. So is it FGM or is it FC, female genital mutilation or female circumcision, right? What you call it is a reflection on your evaluation of it. Many of the people that support it, both men and women, call it female circumcision. Many of the people that are opposed to it call it female genital mutilation, right? So again, this is just an example of how words shape the ideas that we have about these things, okay? And they reflect our values, our bias, and our ideology. And so going back to headscarves and bias, you guys are going to watch a wonderful TED talk by a woman that is discussing headscarves, not female genital mutilation or female circumcision, but talking about headscarves. And I find that this is something that is useful because of our bias here in the United States, the assumptions that we make unconsciously about what it means if we see a woman wearing a headscarf, if we see a woman that chooses to do this in the United States, right? So there's a short video here. I will post a link for it for you guys to check out. I think you're going to enjoy it. It's an interesting conversation. Okay. Thank you guys so much. We will talk soon.